Our last speaker, I believe, not merely of the session, but also of the paper portion of the day, is Jacob Farr. Jacob is a music theory PhD candidate at the University of Kansas, where he will begin his dissertation in the fall of 2026 under the supervision of Brad Osborne. Previously, Jacob graduated with his bachelor's in jazz studies and master's of music theory from the University of Texas at Arlington. His research focuses on musical form with an emphasis on global popular music. We have a round of applause for Jacob, please.
I think there's some handouts making their way around the room right now. I'll be talking about framing functions in Japanese city pop today, but before I jump into the theory side behind framing functions, I first would like to introduce city pop to you if you're unfamiliar with the genre. So city pop is a loosely defined subgenre of Japanese pop music, which began in the late 1970s and continued through the 1980s and early 1990s before the rise of modern J-pop. The genre is notable for its mixture of Western popular music styles, like R&B, disco, yacht rock, synth pop, and rock. And recently, the genre has seen a resurgence of popularity thanks to the internet's ability to make older, more niche music more widely available. I first encountered this music through recommendations on YouTube, for example. Western popular music artists, as well as Japanese record labels, have been following this trend closely. In 2022, The Weeknd released Out of Time, which sampled the intro of Tomoko Ran's 1983 city pop track, Midnight Pretenders. Additionally, many record labels have begun releasing remastered versions of many popular albums in city pop collections like Sony Music's All Light City Pop Collection and City Pop Selections by Universal Music. Now, let's take a moment to explore framing functions in the abstract before looking at some musical examples. In classical form, William Kaplan identifies various formal functions, which can be defined holistically as, quote, relating to some general notions of musical time within a musical phrase. In other words, a function portrays a sense of temporal placement within a phrase or phrase group, a sense of being in relation to surrounding formal units. For example, the presentation phrase of a sentence feels like it's beginning or initiating a musical phrase. Functions can also exist at different hierarchical levels, and it's often the case that formal functions have corresponding formal units or theme types in Kaplan's terms. Recent studies have adapted Kaplan's initiating, medial, and cadential functions to the analysis of popular music, with various nominal differences shown here in Figure 1. Framing functions, an important part of Kaplan's theory, have received little scholarly attention. This lack of focus on framing functions may result from the lower hierarchical status of their associated formal units, introductions, links, which I'll call re-intros following Hudson 2021, and outros. Throughout classical form, Kaplan discusses various functions which can be somewhat difficult to define since they can, as I said, exist at multiple hierarchical levels, and at times the formal functions overlap with formal theme types. The four main functions Kaplan's model includes are initiating, medial, concluding, and framing. And I've provided an example of a corresponding formal unit for each function in Figure 2. Note that presentation, continuation, and cadential are also themselves functions that exist on a lower hierarchical level. My interpretation of formal functions in popular music, shown in Figure 3, includes 5 distinct functions rather than the 4 present in Kaplan's theory. In my view, continuation as function roughly corresponds to build-up function, while medial function remains independent. A formal unit with build-up function has a strong temporal sense of leading to something else. A pre-chorus leads to the chorus. A formal unit with medial function, on the other hand, has a strong sense of being in the middle of something. A bridge in a pop song exists as an independent formal unit in the middle of a song. For now, though, I'll set medial function aside so I can focus on framing functions. For Kaplan, framing functions have the temporal quality of being, quote, before the beginning or after the end. This is to account for features like slow introductions or final codas in sonata form movements of symphonies, for example. In cases like these, the beginning of the sonata form proper does not occur until the entrance of the main theme. As I show throughout this presentation, popular music more deeply integrates formal units with framing function into the overall structure. Therefore, I prefer to view framing functions as simply having the temporal sense of being before or after something, rather than before the beginning or after the end. I refer to the former as introductory framing function and the latter as terminal framing function. An example of this would be a song's outro, which has a temporal sense of being after the final chorus. The remainder of my presentation begins with a brief overview and examples of 3 formal units with framing function, and concludes with a case study of one song in which framing functions have an even greater significance. Popular music, especially in the later decades of the 20th century, often begins with introductory framing function in the form of an intro, rather than just beginning with a verse or a chorus. As the name suggests, an intro is a formal unit that begins the song and has the temporal sense of being before the verse. The intro establishes the groove, timbral palette, and the harmonic identity of the song. By introducing the listener to the sound world of the song in this way, intros set up expectations for what the next few minutes will have in store. In general, the intro will match the energy of the chorus or a verse, and I've found no examples so far of an intro that's structurally equivalent to a pre-chorus. I also make the distinction between intros that are just a single part and those that have multiple distinct phrases, single or multi-part intros. Now let's listen to the intro of the track The Pain of Joy by Shoji Kumi from her 1991 album Prime. Take note of how this multi-part intro hooks you in as a listener by introducing the groove, the harmony that will weave its way into the verse. And note that this and many other intros in city pop are intricately crafted with jazz big band-esque full ensemble hits, which in the case of The Pain of Joy weave their way into the beginning of the verse. This is intro part 1. Figure 4 displays the form of Koichi Kawamura's 1989 song, Out of the Night, which features a single part intro. The form is displayed in the far left column, and the timestamps are displayed in the middle column with measure numbers in parentheses. We'll listen to just the intro for now, but shortly return to Out of the Night when discussing re-intros and outros. Re-intros are an internal formal unit that's often situated in between the first and second verse-chorus rotations, but could appear at other points in a song's form. It's distinct from other smaller formal units like transitions or links because it explicitly reuses material from the introduction of the song. If a re-intro appears in a song with a multi-part intro, it will most likely just reiterate the final part of the intro. Bringing back figure 4, Out of the Night, let's now listen to the re-intro, which is situated as is typical in between the first 2 verse-chorus rotations. while most reintros appear in between the first two verse-chorus rotations, like it does here, there are some examples where reintros occur at different points in a song's form. Take Michiru Kojima's 1985 song, Ocean Blue, which is represented here in Figure 5, which features among its various formal idiosyncrasies a reintro as the penultimate section in the song, which is then followed by a third verse that fades out, ending the song, instead of the expected final chorus fade out. We'll listen to the introduction first, and then I'll skip over to the re-intro towards the end of the song. Now when we listen to the re-intro, you'll note that there's no longer an extra half measure at the end of that section. Right into the verse that time. Now, it might be reasonable to consider at this point how the re-intro fits within this form-functional perspective. I argue that the re-intro does not just have a single function, but in fact has three distinct yet simultaneous functions. By appearing after the chorus, the re-intro obtains terminal framing function. By appearing before a verse, it obtains introductory framing function. And finally, by appearing in between two verse-chorus rotations, or at another internal point within a song's form, it obtains medial function. The final formal unit that I'll talk about today is the outro, which is the pop music representative of terminal framing function. Outros are one way to end a song other than fading out on the final chorus, which was extremely popular in the 80s. But, of course, these outros still often do fade out. Outros can be either dependent, where the musical material is based on the introduction, or independent, with novel musical material. Returning briefly again to Kawamura's Out of the Night, we have a third use of the intro material, now as a dependent outro, which is itself looped and faded to end the song. I'll just play a reminder of the re-intro and then the outro immediately after. During the outro, the band lets loose in riffs a lot more than they do in these internal re-intros. Figure 7 shows the form of Tomoko Aran's Midnight Pretenders, which features an independent outro in the form of a vamp with a keyboard solo. I'll play the intro so you get a sense for the song, and then I'll skip to the ending of the outro. Now, an extended analysis of framing functions in Koichi Kawamura's Weekend Mermaid will serve as a case study to conclude the presentation. Weekend Mermaid has a multi-part intro with three distinct phrases that provide the listener with their first impression of the groove, the instrumentation. It sets up the harmony that's to come, and importantly provides motivic kernels that reappear at significant points throughout the song. Additionally, the third part of the intro occurs 3 times throughout the song, appearing first as an introductory framing function, then a triple functioning re-intro, and finally terminally framing function outro. The only other section in this song that appears 3 times is the chorus. Now we'll listen to the first 2 parts of the intro of Weekend Mermaid and briefly listen to other sections in which the intro's motives manifest. Intro part 1. The introduction of Weekend Mermaid includes 2 important motives that reappear throughout the song. Motive A, labeled with the blue curved brackets, is melodic, while motive B is primarily rhythmic and shown in the red brackets. In measure 3, the dotted 8/16th figure is expanded to include the upbeat of beat 1 and beat 2. This is labeled motive B1. Motive B is further developed into B2 with the addition of the last 3 16th partials of beat 4. As we move into the third part of the intro, motive B2 reappears in the vocal line. A new iteration of motive B, motive B3, appears at the end of the 4-bar phrases in intro part 3, with yet another rhythmic variation on the original dotted 8/16th rhythm. The final version of motive B appears multiple times in the verse, shown in example 2C, but now has a notably different melodic contour. Let's take a listen. In the pre-chorus, motive B3 appears again with another melodic variation. The dotted quarter 8th note rhythm in the very next measure, the third measure of the excerpt here, could also be interpreted as a rhythmically augmented version of motive B. Finally, the pickups to the chorus are a rhythmically augmented version of the very first motive, the ascending scalar fragment from scale degree 3 to 5, played by the synth in the introduction. The ending refrain of the chorus also brings back motive B3 in an iteration most like that of the pre-chorus. In Weekend Mermaid, the frequent usage of the introductory motives and the continual return to the intro in the form of re-intro and outro are representative of the significance of framing functions in pop music, especially pop music that's in some variation of verse-chorus form. Before concluding, I want to briefly consider for a moment how framing functions interact with the rotational nature of verse-chorus forms, including those with the pre-chorus. To me, the relative modularity of formal units with framing function actually blurs the boundary between something purely cyclic and something much more linear. In fact, various placements of the introductory material and features like bridges or other medial sections in an otherwise rotational context are the detours that make what could be a straightforward musical journey all the more satisfying. And although there's a diminishing frequency of framing function in post-millennial pop, they do still appear occasionally, and some songs like The Weeknd's Blinding Lights or the aforementioned Out of Time still feature significant introductions that can convey framing function. And I'm sure many of you can think of examples of songs from the past 20 years that have significant introductions or outros. We heard a lot about that earlier in the 2 years after Brat's summer session. And to conclude, while initiating, build-up, and arrival functions have been discussed at length, framing and medial functions have yet to receive adequate attention. I argue that framing functions are integral to the form of Japanese city pop music and 80s pop music in general, and shouldn't be cast aside or relegated to a lower status. As I continue work with this project, things I want to consider are how this fits within the narrative of the song, and I need to begin work on translation of the lyrics, which I've just started doing with one of my colleagues back from Texas. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Jacob for his paper. We have time for questions, of course.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. My question is about your redefinition of intro as being before something and terminal as being after something. I guess when I hear terminal, I think at the end, not just after, but like after everything. And so I'm trying to think of ways that intros could have been linked, or that terminal function could happen anywhere else but the end. Do you have examples or clarification?
I think that's a really good question. So basically, how can something be terminal if it's not the very end of the song? If we're thinking about a pop song like this in multiple verse-chorus units, you could make the argument that that unit does have an end, and if it ends with a re-intro, that could achieve terminal framing function. But maybe it's just not the best term, and something like epilogic would be maybe a little bit more applicable to things like this. Yeah.
I mean, justice for framing functions. Yeah. I think it's really cool that it's almost kind of the opposite of my talk, where there's so much emphasis on the intro as its own independent, source of music versus the very end. And so I'm wondering if, I know you use the word outro, but do you see in this repertoire the ending of songs being entirely new material as opposed to similar background? Because I know you played some of the independent outros that still had the background music of the intros, but with the solo on top of it. But entirely new music happening at the end of the songs. Do you notice that in this repertoire?
So basically, have I found examples of songs that have completely new musical material at the end? I can't name any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are songs that exist that do feature completely new outros. I think for my purposes, I'm kind of relating these three sections together, so the examples that I chose specifically kind of rely on the fact that the outro is so similar to the intro and the re-intro.
Totally. I guess Carlos and Drew.
Thank you for a great talk. I was just, I was very interested in the Weekend Mermaid example, and in that instance in particular, the re-intro, because I was having a little bit of trouble just following kind of what defines medial versus framing in that re-intro, especially the one that happens in the middle, right? So I think what's the difference? Is it a purely philological difference? What makes that different from like a bridge or like a little interlude, so to speak, or would you consider maybe to insert even more Kaplan into the talk, a little bit more of like a sort of like formal fusion of sorts, like medial becomes framing or something like that?
I think that's actually a really, really great way that I can go forward with this, is integrating maybe that idea of formal fusion, because maybe that's exactly what's going on with the re-intros. Even though if you just played it independently, this re-intro would sound exactly like the third part of the intro itself, functionally it is quite different. So I think the fusion route might be maybe the best way forward so far. So thanks for that suggestion. I think what distinguishes it from the bridge, especially, is that the bridge is completely new musical material. And so maybe that would be more easily defined as medial. But I think just based off of the fact that it's in between, that is kind of what gives it both framing and medial for my purposes here.
Jim, go ahead.
Yes. The city pop is associated with the Japanese bubble period, right? Like, and so there's like something that culturally marks this genre in its entirety. And when I listen to examples, especially the one that ends in the solo, like jazzy solo, that kind of like fades out. It reminds me of Billy Joel's "Just the Way You Are." That kind of like American beginning with the saxophone solo that's like disappears. So I wonder what makes this a Japanese sound. Or are you going for like this thing as like a cultural marker of it, or is there anything that's related to like the rise of instrumental music in Japan at this time? I'm familiar with Japanese fusion jazz band like Cassiopeia or G-Square, those kind of things. Are they like being featured in the first part as a prize, like a musical virtuoso, and then you're singing with them? That kind of, is there anything that really ties to the Japanese culture at the time with this analysis?
What I would say is, timeline-wise, I don't know exactly how it played out at this point. That's something I need to definitely look into more. Potentially, maybe if the kind of Japanese jazz fusion was on the rise, maybe slightly before these kind of songs with like soloistic elements deeply integrated, I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore. In terms of if this is maybe like a uniquely Japanese aesthetic, the intro, re-intro framing function idea, I don't think I could say that for certainty right now, because I think there are likely plenty of Western pop songs, or maybe even other global popular music. Like there's a Brazilian musician, Javan, who had a lot of city pop sounding records that came out in the 80s, and I think there's these framing functions integrated there as well. So I would have to do a little bit more looking into that for sure. But thank you for the question.
We have time for at least one more. Okay, I'll go in the back.
Thanks, that was a great paper. You may have covered this and I just missed it because it's the end of the day. But so what you're calling re-intro and that whole threefold function of ending something, beginning another thing, and being a medial function, I've come to understand that as people refer to like a link as fulfilling those three functions. So I was wondering, because I noticed in one of your analyses, we didn't hear it, but you have a separate function labeled link. So
Yes.
is there a distinction between those two in these analyses?
For my purposes, re-intro has to use material from the intro itself. Where I have link written in that one example, it's not from the intro. It's a new, shorter musical section that I believe is connecting two choruses as well. And so it has kind of a different function there. Instead of reintroducing the whole cycle, it's just linking two choruses together. So that's my reasoning for the terminology here.
All right, we have time for one last question, which I saw a hand for. So go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you for this really interesting paper. So focusing on the intro specifically, I think you mentioned that you found no examples so far where the intro is sort of functionally like a pre-chorus or a building. Is that?
Yeah.
So I wonder if it sort of makes me think about like Mark Spicer's accumulative form. Have you found any examples where the introduction, if it's multiple parts, they're like building up layers one by one, adding instruments or anything like that?
I don't know of any city pop examples off the top of my head that have the kind of accumulation effect of where maybe it just starts with drums, then bass, keyboards come in, then vocals come in. What I do notice is that when there's a multi-part intro, in like the Michiru Kojima example, the first part was no groove. It was the string sections playing and kind of at a much lower dynamic level. That's maybe the closest equivalent I can think to something like the accumulation effect, is where the first part of the intro has that kind of lower dynamic energy level, and then it kind of immediately jumps to a much higher energy level with like the second or third part.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Can we have one more round of applause for all three of our speakers? All right. Thank you, and see you all tomorrow.